Writing English, written by Alyksandur. Author's note: time measurements converted to human readable for ease of reading. English is, bluntly, ugly. Professor Gishpayakai Tenorai said. The McGavishian structure, using the language in question. Its grammatical structures are similar enough to ours, and most of the phonemes match pretty well. But unlike McGavish, it is a mishmash of over half a dozen root languages, all of which were arguably worse, and those are just the languages English draws from. There are plenty more around Earth that were entirely separate, and worse. German comes from one of the same roots as English. French comes from a different common root with English. Both are hideous to learn. I know, I tried. Formal and familiar addresses, intrinsically gendered objects, it's the stuff of linguistic nightmares, he said with a shudder. And don't even get me started on Finnish, or on languages like Japanese, which doesn't even have an alphabet. Same for Chinese, which comes in both traditional and simplified written forms for ostensibly the same language. English is a cakewalk compared to all of that. So, isn't English one of the most widely spoken languages in the Orion Tetrad? Asked one of his students, also in English, as per the requirements of the class. One of the most widely spoken, yes, it is, and that's mainly because its spoken form, aside from a handful of homophones, is surprisingly straightforward compared to its written form. But if you asked anyone aside from Terrans or maybe the Vasturi to actually write English, they would give you something that looked like it was written by a 5-year-old. Even humans themselves need 6 or more years to become really proficient in their written language. The professor paused there for the anticipated uproar from his students. Cries of impossible, ridiculous, and that can't be right came from around the lecture hall. He could hardly blame them. McGavish could usually be mastered. Full mastery, not just proficiency, in less than half that, even to non-native speakers. He let the class work the worst of the outburst out before raising a hand to silence everyone. So doesn't it only take the Vasturi 3 years to master English in its written form? One student asked. It does, but they're linguistic prodigies. They master English faster than they do Vasturi, but theirs is a highly nuanced and complex language. It's elegant and precise. McGavish is straightforward and blunt by comparison. It's a communicative language. It tends to convey the intended meaning with no frills attached. Miriam, for all of his unpronounceability, is dramatic, narrative, and bold, almost to the point of being a self-caricature. One of his students started to speak, but the professor forestalled her with a raised hand. Before any of you object, yes, all 3 of these languages can be used in a similar capacity, but none of them really feel natural in doing so. A fairly normal sentence in McGavish comes across as aggressive when directly translated to Vasturi, or bland in Marian. Direct translation from Vasturi to McGavish often sounds like it's being nitpicky, and Marian is eloquent, but feels like it came from an epic saga. I can just imagine what the Mirians and the Vasturi think of each other's languages, one of the students piped up, and a ripple of low laughter ran through the class. Even the professor chuckled. There have been some interesting diplomatic issues needing mediated between them, yes. But let me finish. I'll get to the questions and comments in a bit. English can do all of what the other languages naturally do, and without sounding unnatural itself. It's almost impossibly flexible language, but only because it has so many origins, and even then only by being a nearly incomprehensible clusterfuck. The professor smiled inwardly. That got his students' attention. Use of an unexpectedly blunt or even vulgar word in an otherwise polite or even formal speech was a distinctly Terran weapon, and one that rarely failed to have devastating results when deployed properly. As an English professor, it's one of Gish's favorite tactics. Just to make sure all of you know the basics of English alphabet, correct? He asked. Several students dutifully began singing it like Terran schoolchildren, getting another ripple of laughter from the class. Gish waved them to silence with a little laugh of his own. I'll take that as a yes, and want you all to type out the following 2 sentences. The fat father fought his fate. He attacked heartache with an icicle. He watched the progress of his students on his monitor, smiling to himself as the overwhelming majority of them came to a dead standstill over the middle of the 3rd word. Fortunately, the word "the" was so ubiquitous that most of them could spell it, and referenced it for the TH sound needed. The last word in the first sentence really threw them all for a loop. By the time everybody had signaled that they were done, only one student out of the 50 or so in the class had correctly typed the 2 sentences up. But he was fairly impressed that 3 others were at least close. Before I show you the right way to write it, and one of you got it right, I want to talk to you after class because now I'm curious. Before I show you the right way to write it, I want to show you how I wrote it as a student in my first English class. Making sure his terminal was connected to the screen behind him, he started typing. The fat father fought his fat heat utak heart ack with an icicle. Looking at what all of you typed, a lot of you did something pretty similar, he said. And by the McGarvish rules, this all makes sense. Mostly. Want to see how it's supposed to look? He asked with an almost evil grin, and his students all nodded in varying degrees of apprehension. Underneath his first attempt at the 2 sentences, he typed them properly. He waited silently, counting down in his head for when he knew the eruption would come. Class was right on schedule. Outraged to confused exclamations of nonsense or that doesn't make any sense, and more than a few what the fuck bounced around the room for a few seconds before he again silenced them with a raised hand. He didn't scold any of them, save one student. Language misbravoxdena, he said mildly, with a faint grin. She grimaced. English, not McGarvish. Sorry, she murmured. But yes, that was my general first reaction to seeing it spelled the right way. It does make sense, though. As long as you know the rules behind how to pronounce things, and when to ignore them. Let's take the first sentence. The fat father fought his fate. He's highlighted fat father and fate. All 3 of these start with the same first 3 letters, but none of them use the same vowel sound. We McGarvish use different letters for different sounds, but the English language frequently has one letter represent different sounds, depending on usage, usually vowels. But sometimes consonants too. He highlighted icicle to illustrate his point. Why do they use 2 letters to make one sound, like the TH in father? A student asked. Oh, that's nothing. They also use 1 letter to make 2 sounds sometimes, the professor said. 2 of their letters explicitly do so. In fact, J and X. From there was a barrage of questions and comments. How does that spell icicle? The I's and the C's both sound different. Why is there an E in fate when you can't hear it? Why does the CH in heartache sound like the C in icicle? I thought S made the S sound, not the Z sound. What is the letter C supposed to even do? Do Terrans even know how letters work? Gish finally waved them all to silence again, and pointed at the student who had asked the last question. They do, but they have bizarre and arcane rules for a lot of them. Even the Bestruri have a trouble with it. And most Murians don't even bother with written English beyond the absolute basics unless they're in a diplomatic field. This, he pointed back to the 2 sentences on the monitor behind him, is just to showcase a few of the apparent inconsistencies of English. They are consistent inconsistencies, though. It's just a matter of taking everything you know about language, wadding it into a ball, and setting it on fire. You will need to learn the basics of no preconceived notions attached. It's a brutal written language to learn, but it can be learned. Sir, out of curiosity, how many students do you usually have make it through this class? Gish nodded. If more than half of you are still here for the final, I'll be amazed. If more than half of that passed, I'll eat my desk, terminal and all. I'll say this bluntly, English is hard. I'll go into the history of this language over the course of this class, a lot of which will probably be rehashed from the spoken English classes. But the written form is where a lot of that really comes out. But just remember that when the Terrans unified, or more or less unified, he corrected himself, the language they settled on as an official language of the planet Earth was English, because a large percentage of the population already spoke it, and the alternatives were almost universally worse. How did they ever make any kind of advancements at all with linguistic systems that were so nonsensical? One student asked, intending the question to only be an aside to the classmate next to him, but Gish caught it and chuckled dryly. I don't claim to be an anthropological researcher or anything of the sort, but I have my own little theory here. English is bad. Most of the languages are worse, but they still mastered them. My guess is that if they could understand that, they could understand anything. End of story. I'd quickly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.